for a hearing to review the Boston Police Department's body-worn camera pilot program. The preliminary study results: the Boston Police Department began a 6-month body-worn camera pilot program in September of 2016, and a full evaluation is expected to be released in June. This is a preliminary hearing to listen to exactly what we have found today. I'll turn it over to our good Commissioner Evans. I know that with the snowstorm coming in, there's a lot of preparation for you and the basic city services staff. So you may have to step out, and I certainly understand that. So if you can just introduce your team and open with your opening comments, that would be great. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Councilman. This one?
Yeah, Carrie will take care of it.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you for hosting us. With me today is. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. Again, I'll start over. I'm Commissioner Bill Evans. I want to thank the councilors for hosting this meeting on body cameras. My team with me today is Superintendent John Daly, who's in charge of our administration and technology. He's a superintendent in charge of that, and he's been instrumental throughout this whole body camera procedure on not only the whole specifics of it, but also dealing with the cost and estimates. So, and also with me is Jack McDevitt, who's a professor at Northeastern, and Anthony Braga, also both have been instrumental in looking at the data, and we look forward in June to the final results. I know we're going to talk today about preliminary results, and I want to thank them for dealing with that issue, but I think we're all waiting for the final results in June. So, just to go back a little ways, we started this process of 100 officers wearing the body cameras back in September of 2017. The officers wore them for 6 months originally. After the 6 months, we attended a meeting in Mattapan. I think Councilor Campbell hosted, where we heard a lot of feedback on some of the technicalities. And one of the things brought up then was to see if we could extend it another 6 months, because we only had a snapshot of September to March, and those usually aren't our busiest months, so we extended it the full year. In leading up to this, we had not only community meetings, but also we had a social justice task force, which Councilor Campbell, a lot of clergy, a lot of the community members were on it, and they helped us craft the policies and some of the procedures, who was going to wear them, what districts. They wanted the gang unit to wear them. So the procedure, the way it went in, was well thought out by the Social Justice Task Force. And preliminary, the results, honestly, Jack and them can get more into detail, but, from the most part, I think it's all been positive. I haven't heard one complaint from the officers for wearing them at all. In fact, I think a lot of them were encouraged by wearing them. I think it does a lot of things. One, it helps quell some of the disturbances they run into when people see they're on camera. Sometimes they take it down a little bit. I think we've seen the value of bringing those cases to court, especially in gun cases where it's all on video. I know that the district attorney's office likes them. I know the defense attorneys like them. So procedurally wise, as the court, they're good. Also, they've been excellent in investigations. Just having that camera out there has helped in taking some of these gang issues out of the mix, because it allows us to sort of have video footage and put together the gang sort of organization. So from an organizational standpoint, it's all positive. It really is. The only negative is sometimes the officers, when they're in foot pursuit, they lose the cameras. Sometimes when they're in just fights, they get ripped off their body. But other than that, things have gone real well. I think year to date, we have 38,200 videos that we've gotten in that year. 4,600 hours of footage for the most part. And in at least 2 cases, complaints brought against officers was cleared by viewing the video. So they've also been good to sort of back our officers on frivolous complaints. So for the most part, things are good. I think the preliminary year showed that we had, I think, 12 less 12 less civilian complaints against us for the year, one for each month, which isn't significant, for 12 months. And we also had 7 less use of force, as reported by the officers, which is required. But we really don't have a major problem in the department on use of force. And back in 2011, we had 80 citizens' complaints of excessive force. In 2017, we just had 21. So it's steadily declining over the years, anyone complaining about excessive force in the Boston Police Department, and also with citizens' complaints. Back in 2013, we registered 360. Last year, we had 211. So you can see, without the body cameras, our numbers in the behavior complained again has significantly gone down. This most likely will only improve that, as this study has shown. But I come in here saying, right from the get-go, I don't think Mayor Walsh and myself have really opposed this. The biggest question always is, how much is it going to cost? This has been a thorough and comprehensive study, and that's what the mayor and I wanted from the get-go, just to weigh the costs versus the benefits. And from talking to all the officers out there, they're all on board. I think they all like it. And so, what the big question is the costs. John can talk if there's further questions, but we estimate $7 million to equip all the officers in the first year, and over the first 5 years, up to $25 million. So that's the only sort of point that we've really sort of contested. But as I sit before you today, I think the mayor realizes the positive benefits to this, and I do, and I think the department, although a little reluctant to jump into it at first, have seen that it protects their members well, and obviously it helps us tremendously as we deal sometimes with a public out there that unfortunately is not too nice to us.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for your thorough introduction. A couple protocol issues. First, a couple people have joined us. Councilor Edwards, Councilor Zakem, Councilor Asabi George, and Councilor O'Malley have joined us today. Also, I want to remind everybody that this is a public hearing being recorded and broadcasted on Comcast 8, RCN 82, and Verizon 1964. If you do want to testify, you can sign up on the over to my left here, and you'll have a couple minutes to testify. And also, please silence your cell phones and other devices as we get into the hearing. So I'll hand it back over to Superintendent Daley. Or do you want? Or do you want? Okay, all right. If that's it.
These guys talk about the preliminary report,
that'd be
and then
great.
We can get into the cost. And then
that'd be great. Yep, that'd be great. Jack, always good to see you.
Good to see you. Hi, I'm Anthony Braga. I'm the director of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Northeastern University. And with Professor McDevitt, we're leading the study of the impacts of the body-worn cameras on a range of different outcome measures for the city of Boston. And as the commissioner suggested, the body-worn camera study was launched in 5 districts. Those are 2, 3 policing districts, 2, 3, 4, 14, 18, and also the Youth Violence Strike Force. And we were fortunate that both the mayor and the commissioner were very supportive of a rigorous study of the impacts of the cameras. We were able to pursue a randomized experiment, which is generally considered the gold standard in program evaluation, where we randomly allocated officers to 2 groups. One group was a camera group or a treatment group, and the other group was a comparison group. And the nice thing about randomization is it allows you to assume that there aren't any systematic differences between the 2 groups, facilitating an apples-to-apples comparison. In other words, when we look at the effects of the camera, the only thing difference between the officers who receive the camera and the officers who don't would be the cameras themselves. So as the commissioner mentioned, the police department had 100 cameras to place on officers. And we selected officers who were working the day shift and the first half shifts for the police department. There were 281 officers who were eligible, who were actually doing patrol work or working in the gang unit to be included in the study. And we randomly allocated those to the two groups, resulting in 140 officers who were in the camera group and 141 officers who were in the comparison group. When we looked at the different characteristics that we're able to measure on the officers, that being sex, race, age, years on the job, shift assignment, the prior complaints that they had up until that point in time, as well as prior use of force reports that they made, there were no systematic differences between the two groups, so we were able to achieve that apples-to-apples comparison, which was important for the integrity of the design. All 140 officers who were in the camera group were trained in how to use the camera and the policy that the Boston Police Department developed. However, from the initiation of the program, since there were only 100 cameras, those were placed on only 100 of those 140 officers, and the 40 other officers were alternates that would be drawn upon as officers cycled out of their assignments. The period of the experiment was for 1 year, and during that time period, we had 21 officers who were in the treatment group change assignments or get promoted or go out on medical leave that needed to be replaced. So they were replaced over the course of this study. So there were a total of 121 officers who, over that 1 year period, wore the cameras. We decided to do our comparison of the full 140 who were trained in the policy relative to the 141 who didn't. It's, to be a little nerdy, it's a design choice known as intent to treat. If you want me to talk later about why that's a good thing to do, it's essentially if you train officers to behave a certain way, you would expect that they would change their behavior anyways because they were trained in what was being examined in the study. It was also important because 100 officers wearing the cameras, is a relatively small sample to observe. And as I'll mention in a minute, these are very rare events that we're looking at in our preliminary impact assessment. So having more officers available to include in the study, I think, was a good design decision. So for the preliminary results, we reported on officer use of force reports and officer complaints. And it's worth noting here that, for us on the research team, there was this real challenge of trying to detect an effect of the cameras because the base rates of both of these events were very small. So for the officers in the treatment and control groups, before the cameras were implemented, for complaints, they had a rate of 0.22, which is an average of 1 complaint every 5 years. For use of force, it was 0.12, which translates to, on average, 1 use of force report every 10 years. So these are, very low base rates in a relatively small sample over only a year period to really observe change. So that's one of the challenges of our design that, as we go forward, we can continue to wrestle with. So when we did the statistical analysis, as the commissioner mentioned, we found some very small impacts, and that was in part because of the size of the sample and the rare event base rates that we're dealing with. For those officers who wore the camera relative to officers who didn't, they had 12 fewer complaints, or on average 1 fewer per month of wearing the cameras as a group. And for use of force, the difference was 7 use of force reports. We were able to confirm that this relatively modest reduction in complaints was significant, which means that we didn't observe it just by chance alone, because things can go up, things can go down. There are random fluctuations. And the use of force, it was on the smaller side, so we couldn't confirm that with confidence at this point in time that it wasn't just a chance reduction. However, stepping back, taken as a whole, these suggest there were very small but notable improvements on those two dimensions. And I think relative to, I should mention, I've done a body-worn camera experiment in Las Vegas where the base rates were much higher. So there was a lot more room for improvement. I think the case in Boston is they had a small effect, but there wasn't a lot of room for improvement given the very low base rates. We're going to continue to look at the numbers and, look at it in different ways to see if the effects change as time has gone on. A few of the other measures that we're looking at, we're also looking at whether there's any changes in police officer work activities. There are some that suggest that when you outfit officers with cameras, they might, second guess their behaviors. They might be less likely to engage, less likely to be proactive. So we're going to be looking at arrests, FIOs, incident reports, the amount of proactive stops that they do. We're also going to look at whether the cameras have any impact on the lawfulness of police-citizen interactions, looking at whether there's any changes in the racial distribution on who's being stopped, who's being arrested for officers wearing cameras relative to those who aren't, and any indicators of changes in the legality of if there is a frisk or a search in a stop, whether there's any changes there across the two groups. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Jack McDevitt, to talk a little bit about some of the community measures and other aspects of the work we've been doing.
Sure. Thank you, Anthony. And thank you very much for having the hearing. What my role on the project is to talk a little bit about the community reaction to the cameras being out there. And to get that, what we've done so far is to have a number of community meetings with different groups as they meet with their members. There's been over 100 community members interviewed, as well as people representing different places in government. I take a step back and say that the Commissioner mentioned the Social Justice Task Force, which with Reverend Mark Scott, I co-chair, and that group has had a pretty direct and ongoing role in how this has been implemented. And there's been reports back to that group, and that group's had feedback. And one of the places where the group suggested, as the Commissioner said, was the original plan was for 50 cameras, and the group said maybe it would be better if we had 100. And it turned out to be an insightful comment because it helps with the numbers that Anthony just talked about in terms of having enough numbers to be able to make some kind of a finding. So I said we've met with over 100 community members in different groups. The preliminary findings have been that the community members really think the Boston Police Department is a good department overall, that it's above average, that it's a department that they think of as one of the better ones in the country. They also really like the officers that they work with. They have good relationships with individual officers who work with their organization or that they have a relationship with. And those relationships seem to bear a lot of fruit and have a lot of trust in those individual officers. But they also say that, there's more than 2,000 officers in the Boston Police Department, so they don't know them all. And there's concerns about, how many, the ones I know are really good, are they all really good? And I don't know that. So that's been something that was articulated. Most of the people that we've spoken with and interviewed are happy that the city's engaged in this pilot program. They think of it as a step in the right direction. They are looking forward to the answers that will come from Northeastern and from the Boston Police Department in terms of how effective they are. They also, one of the things that I would say is that, again, think about the numbers. If 100 officers are wearing cameras like Anthony just laid out for you, and there's 2,000 officers out there interacting with the public, we haven't run into very many people that have had an interaction with an officer with the camera. So, we're still looking, we're still going to continue to have community groups, and I would encourage anyone from the council that has lists of groups that we could reach out to let me know, and I'd be happy to go and talk to them. One of the things I guess I would say as an overall measure is that most of the community groups we spoke to think cameras are the future in policing, that it's going to be something that police departments will just have in the future. And so they think of that as something, as the Commissioner said, that any good police department will have cameras as part of its repertoire. So that has been one of the findings. The second thing, though, is that they share the concern that you heard articulated already about, well, what are the opportunity costs? How much is this going to cost, and what are we going to not pay for to be able to to have the cameras on everybody. So that's come up a number of times and asked, you know, will we have a number? Will we know what that's going to do for the city and for the police department and all of that? And that's something that people are concerned about and trying to figure out how they would deal with that. The other group that we've met with that I think is pretty interesting is we're meeting with different court officials. So we've met with the defense bar, and we'll be meeting with prosecutors and judges. And the defense bar thinks that it really makes a difference in court if there's a camera there. As you all know, a lot of the back and forth in a court case is a police report that says X and a community member that says Y, and the court's trying to figure out where the truth is in that. If you have a camera, sometimes that explicates that truth. And you get a chance to see whether or not people acted the way they said they did, whether the officer acted the way they said they did. And one thing that's really an added value for the camera from the prosecutors and the defense bar's point of view is the audio. You know, as we know, there's lots of cameras out around the city, and a lot of these incidents get captured on camera, but you don't get a chance to hear the interaction. Here, with the body cameras, you get to hear how the police officer treated the individual, how the individual treated the police officer, and you get a much better feel for how that interaction went down. And so that's something that they're finding is very helpful in bringing the cases to court. I also say that one of the really interesting things that's happened in the community groups is that the community members, as you know in the city, want to be helpful. They want to try to be helpful. So they were saying things like, you know, we could form a group that could review the cameras and talk to you about what's normal behavior for this group or that group, and sort of help you understand how the interactions between the officer and the individual community member might be different. And they were sort of reaching out to do that on their own, to say, we'll be happy to put a group together to help you to do that, and think creatively about how we interact with the police and how our history might inform that. So I think that there's some interesting possibilities as this continues downhill to sort of see how that's been done. And I guess we're also going to be looking at the videos themselves for questions of quality, questions of consistency and that. So we're going to have some, at the final report, some idea about the overall quality of the videos and how that's working. And so we have some students coding those as we speak. So at that point, I'll stop and take any questions for any of us.
Can I just say?
Absolutely, Commissioner.
Looking at this, you know, we looked at other studies, and that's why, you know, we've sort of not only done this pilot, but we've looked at others around the country, and where there's been positive benefits and there's some negative benefits. And, you know, I know Washington, D.C. did a pilot with 1,000 officers, and who wore them and 1,000 didn't, and at the end of it, they didn't really see any difference in any change in behavior. But the one that's interesting, and Anthony talked about, is Las Vegas, where officers wore the cameras. And the issue that what happened was complaints, and I think use of force came down a little bit, but what went up was the amount of arrests and the amount of tickets written. So, you know, it takes away a lot of the discretion where officers used to be able to probably give kids breaks on something. And what they found in Las Vegas is the amount of arrests went up because officers are on video, and I think sometimes they're compelled where they could have gave someone a break that they're going to have to make. So the only concern I might have a little bit is, you know, we're doing a good job with keeping arrests down. I think we're almost down 30% over the last 3 or 4 years. On camera, sometimes that can take away our discretion. So if we were, you know, want to give someone, let's say in the past, a break for doing something, now it's on camera, and there's liability there if, heaven forbid, we let the person go and he hurts someone. And so that's the only thing. I think having cameras, that Las Vegas study, that little concept bothered me that, you know, I think we do a good job of not locking kids up, and sometimes this might tie us in just a little bit, you know. John, you want to talk a little about the costs?
Sure, and I'll be glad to answer any questions about them. But we're looking at, for a full between $5 and $7 million for the first year, Now, some of those costs could go down. We'll negotiate with vendors, but this is based on sort of high-level estimates and quotes that we've received from some of the vendors out there. Some of these costs are also recurring. Others are first-year implementation costs. So, depending on what sort of deal we get from what kind of a vendor, we're probably looking at, between $5 and $7 million on a yearly basis moving forward for a full implementation. If we did approach it, we could also approach it in a way that we would phase it in the first year, maybe begin halfway through the year and do a smaller number of officers and then sort of ramp up from that to lower the impact, the cost impacts.
Thank you very much. Everybody else is here? Okay. So this hearing was offered by President Campbell, so I'll let her open the floor to Councilor Campbell, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you, Councilor McCarthy, and thank you, all of you, for being here. Commissioner Evans, we've grown in our relationship just through this process, and I want to applaud you for the work you've done, but particularly with respect to the Social Justice Task Force, pulling together a group of folks who don't always agree with you. I think the body cameras is a great example of where everyone in the room didn't start on the same page, and Anthony's been there, Jack, and Superintendent Daly as well, around this particular topic. But through different community meetings where we did sort of around the city in partnership, we got to a place where we decided to extend that pilot program to another 6 months, and then so here we are. I will tell you that through the process, I've only grown to now say that we absolutely should do body cameras. I think not only based on conversations with folks on the Social Justice Task Force, with activists and advocates in the room, some of whom are here today, but others who we see in the community, through some of the preliminary findings, but because of all of the benefits you just suggested. So, whether it's useful in court, this idea that technology is coming, unfortunate incidents that we may see here and there with that sort of complement the need to come up with some tools that we know work, and body cameras are one of them. I've gone to a place now, though, where I say, outside, and this is a question I'm going to start with, outside of body cameras, what other technology should we be looking at? And when I say that, Councilor McCarthy and I met with one vendor who was at least trying to enlighten us on what technology looks like. And body cameras, frankly, is like down here compared to all of the other tools that exist in this country when it comes to complementing your community policing efforts. So my first question is, have we given thought to taking this conversation outside of just the context of body cameras and looking at, they have tasers that have body cameras attached to them, looking at technology in general, and what tools might be available for us to do even better policing.
John, you want to talk?
Sure.
Thank you, Superintendent.
Yes, so, and this aligns with the body cameras. For most of the vendors who supply body cameras, they also require mobile devices, iPhones or Android phones. So that's another piece. And I think in policing, some departments, large departments, have formally moved to supplying smart devices to officers. And that's something that we're looking very closely at. And all of the technology tools that could leverage mobility from records management systems to translation software, things like that, that officers could have information at their fingertips, in their cars as they're walking their beats, things like that. I think we're really looking closely at mobility and how to leverage that, and how to do it in a sensible way. But this does align with the body cameras as well.
And the only reason I bring that up is because we often talk about the use of body cameras as if it's only a tool that is going to be effective, of course. I'm not saying you guys on the panel, but just some folks in the community that we engage with on this particular issue, as if it's only a benefit for, say, civilians. We've come to learn through community meetings with officers or other hearings we've had that these are also tools that could benefit our very officers as well, whether it's painting the picture around a particular incident, providing more detail, learning from from what happened going back, using it for training purposes, et cetera. And so the question around, or my sort of suggestion is that we expand it outside of the context of body cameras and look at all technology that might be informative for those purposes. And how might we actually save money by investing in certain technology in a sort of combo kind of fashion. So I push the department to think about it in those terms. Go ahead, Commissioner.
And again, an issue that's, you know, a little bit controversial, but we're ready to roll it out, and obviously we'll go to the community, is the whole issue of drones. You know, I think you talk about cost effective, you know, to have those out at accident reconstruction sites or have them at crime scenes, the ability to fly one and get those measurements and get those camera shots from there, the ability to put them up when we have the Boston Marathon so we get a good snapshot of any security concerns. You know, the whole country is going to them now, police agencies across the country. And, you know, that's the way I think we can move to be smarter and more efficient. And, you know, right now, if we have a crime scene, sometimes we're out there for 3 hours. And heaven forbid, you know, we even have a body at the scene. Those scenes can take quite a long time, tie up a lot of resources, keep streets closed. And that's something we're going to be moving to shortly. And I know, you know, sometimes we get some fight back that we're up to something sinister by rolling those out. It's just so we can be a more effective and efficient department. We don't have anything that we're up to no good putting them out. But people, when you move on technology, they always look at it like we're up to no good. You know, we try to move on social media because we try to prevent tragedies that happen in places like Parkland, you know, even in Winchester or everywhere where we can pick it up. And I think we've moved to be more efficient with our brick on that. But initially, you know, we got called onto the carpet that, you know, you can't be doing this. This is an invasion. So as much as we try to move in your direction, you know, everyone always thinks that our motives aren't the best. But it's all about public safety.
Well, I will say this. I think, you know, you speak to my point that there's an array of technological tools out there. Right. And because we've been having this conversation related to body cameras for some time now, I think we sometimes get sucked into just this one tool called body cameras, which I think we should absolutely do. But there are other technological tools out there that have proven to be efficient or allow you to do your job more efficiently and effectively that we've talked about. So I want us to not get just stuck on the body camera piece. Just 2 more points before I turn it over and I can ask more questions in the second round. So the cost analysis piece, I think, doesn't account for the possibility of settlements going down against the department that could, where we could sort of save on the cost settlement side of things, or what funding might be available at the state or federal level for this purpose. Regardless of how you feel about what's coming out of Washington, there might be some funding opportunities for police departments that are taking on these new technology tools, so I encourage us to look into that. And it's difficult sometimes to monetize the feeling that someone might have when someone is wearing a body camera. So I know that there's some qualitative, outside of the quantitative data that Anthony and Jack are diving into, there is some qualitative data as well, which you're also getting at, having these community meetings and meeting with folks in the community about their interaction either with an officer who had a body camera or their interaction with how they think they might respond with an officer who's wearing a body camera that they haven't interacted with yet. And there's something about this idea of increasing trust, increasing accountability and transparency for both parties that you can't always monetize. So I want us to be mindful of that as well. And sometimes we have to make investments in new things, whether it's drones or things related to social media. But I've heard overwhelming support for this particular tool, and I think we need to then get to the next step, which is what is the process that the department would have to undertake in order to do this on a full-scale basis, or if we did it in a phased way, which I've suggested. If it costs a lot of money, then why not start with the departments that are most questionable, right? And maybe we use certain metrics to determine what departments those are and to roll it out in that way. But I can wait for the second round. But I'd love to hear more about the actual process it would take. Is it negotiating with the unions? Is it the mayor negotiating and having conversations with the unions, you, Commissioner? What else might it take to sort of for this to happen on a full-scale basis?
Well,
And I can go to the
Yeah,
second
I think
one.
that has to happen, a lot of that. And obviously, we're going to have to probably hire 12 to 15 people just to deal with handling the FOIAs, redaction. You know, right now, when people have asked for one little tape, it takes us over 3 or 4 hours to get it. So there's a lot of cost as far as personnel goes. You know, we're going to have to just hire probably, right, John? Probably at least 12 people just to deal with the input and output and requests from it. We know that. But, you know, the mayor, you know, he's going to deal with the negotiation part. I know, you know, the union and the members have seen the benefit. But, you know, I don't want to, it's premature to talk about the negotiations on that. But obviously, I'm sure, you know, that.
But would it actually need to involve negotiating with all the public safety unions, detectives, patrolmen,
Well,
in order for this?
Most likely it will because, you know, we did before,
Yep.
obviously, and I don't see this being any different.
Right.
But that's a conversation we'll have with the mayor.
I can wait for the next one. Thanks, Councilor.
Thank you very much, Councilor. I just have more of a statement, really. When Councilor Campbell was talking about the toolbox, and I think,
Oh, yeah.
you know, we've talked about it at length. You know, every police officer has a right to go home at the end of the day, and anything that will help that police officer go home safely at the end of the day, I'm all about. Whether it's drones, you know, we've talked about tasers a little bit. They record. They can. It's another non-lethal action that a police officer can take that will protect them and also protect the person who they're going to take down. That might be options. Body cameras. We talked about iPhones with ShotSpotter. That they'll actually know exactly what kind of caliber weapon they're walking into a situation in, again, protecting the police officers as well as the people who are in the incident scene, or dashboard cams. So, you know, as the chair, whatever it takes to make sure that the people are safe and, as importantly, our police officers safe, I think is very important. So whatever you need in your toolbox, whether it's $5 million or $7 million or $10 million, we need to make sure that our police force is adequately prepared and to be safe for the people as well as themselves. So that's just more of a statement than anything else. So there you go. Councilor Ed Flynn. I think I just gave you a promotion there. Councilor Ed Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have worked with the Boston Police for almost 10 years as a line probation officer at Suffolk Superior Court, and I think we have the best police officers in the country and the best police department in the country. My question is, if a camera is ripped off a police officer during an arrest, how is that camera replaced, and how much would it cost to replace it? And would BPS have technical staff to do it, or would it be contracted out?
And this has happened. We have lost a few cameras, you know, in scuffles and things like that during the pilot. And basically, we'll have spares, and you know, we just replace the camera, send it back to the manufacturer, and there might be a cost involved, but it wouldn't be too bad.
Okay.
It's a cost of doing business.
Now, if the video is used in court, would it be accessible to the public at that time, or would the public request the video from you, from your office? And if they did, and it's in the public, would that put any type of, you know, any officer, their safety in jeopardy for any reason?
Well, if the video was introduced into the record in court, then it would be, you know, depending on, you know, the controls of the court, you know, it would be available as a public record. If a citizen made a request for a video to the police department, we would review the request, review the video, redact it appropriately to protect any privacy interests, and then it would be a public record that we would release.
Okay. Now, as it relates to the camera itself, is there any way that the camera could not capture the entire situation that's taking place at the time in terms of a certain view that you capture, whether it's 60%, and you might not catch the accurate story of what's actually happening?
Yes, absolutely. The camera just gives a limited field of view. It captures some things. It doesn't capture everything. It might not give a comprehensive view, but it'll give you whatever the camera sees will be recorded.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilor Flynn. Councilor Janey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I also want to acknowledge and thank Councilor Campbell for offering this hearing order. A year ago, I was sitting out in the audience as someone who believed in the importance of body cameras, and I will say that this report has affirmed that belief. Just a couple of questions. I have a few here. Hopefully, I won't go on too long. One of the things that I know as someone who represents and lives in a community of color is that many folks don't go to the police for complaints for a variety of reasons: lack of trust, the belief that there will be retribution, the belief that nothing will happen if they complain about use of force or some other kind of interaction. And so I'm just wondering, do you believe that these numbers could have been higher given that?
Do I believe? You know, again, it's your guess as good as mine. I can tell you we're out there working hard. I think we're doing a great job out there. And yeah, could someone not want to report it because of lack of trust? Yeah, but we make it clear that, you know, you can go on your computer at home and issue the complaint. We have so many ways that we didn't have years ago. We used to have to walk in the station to make a complaint. So if people feel wronged, you know, they don't have to approach the station. We take complaints over the phone. We take them through the computer. There's many ways that they shouldn't feel intimidated. But I think what's encouraging is the numbers clearly show that we're working a lot harder, and I think we're earning a lot of respect because the use of force and our civilian complaints over the last 5 years has almost gone down half of what it used to be.
Yeah, and I noticed that. I was wondering when the 2017 data would be available.
I can probably get it to you in the next week or so.
Could you speak to the sample size and why it was so small, given that there are 2,100 officers on the force?
Well, I think if you look at any sample around the country, I think most of them have been doing 50 or 100. I don't think you know, that seems to be, you know, we've looked at other studies, and that gives you a good snapshot. We covered 5 districts, probably 2 or 3 of them are our busiest districts where we might have negative interaction sometimes. The gang unit, where sometimes, you know, they're the unit that's out there always interacting with some of the gang kids. So we try to put them in the areas. But most pilot programs we've seen across the country, they only use that amount of size.
And how often were cameras turned off?
Well, we have procedures on when they're on and when they're off. And for the most part, any interaction out there, whether it's a car stop or an interaction with during a field interrogation, they're required to put them on. Where they're turned off is obviously on the officer's free time, but also if we come across a domestic violence. We don't want that on video. That's people's private lives. If we come to a sexual assault, we don't want the videos that the victim doesn't want to speak to us. And we ask people when we're going into their homes, across their threshold, which, you know, the home's the most private place to be, we advise them that we're coming into their home, do they want the camera on? And if they don't want the camera on, we usually shut it off for them. But, you know, we will put it on in those exigent circumstances where we want the interaction to be filmed, because we can't just have it one way. We have to protect the public, but also protect, if we're in a confrontation on the street with a group, we're going to put that camera on. And sometimes that brings the tension right down, but also we want to use it as a tool so that people know what type of behavior we're subject to too. Because unfortunately on the street now, a lot of times we don't get a lot of respect sometimes, but putting that camera on sometimes makes a load of difference that we capture that.
Yeah. I noticed on, I think it's on page 6 of the report, that it talked about the demographics of the officers with cameras and without cameras. And I was wondering if you could talk about how those numbers compare to the overall police force.
Maybe Anthony, he's the statistician. I'm not sure. Go ahead, Anthony.
Yeah, they're generally representative of the entire police force. However, I mean, the task at hand wasn't to necessarily create a sample of officers that was representative of the police force at large. It was to create a fair comparison between officers who were wearing the cameras versus officers who weren't wearing the cameras to make sure there was no systematic differences. So this would be representative of officers in the slice of the department that participated in the study, which would be districts 2, 3, 4, 14, 18, the Youth Violence Strike Force. It's representative of officers who are working those 2 shifts that we mentioned in those assignments, but not the department as a whole.
And just a couple more, if that's okay. Of the interactions with civilians, could you tell me how many were people of color, what their ages, what their genders were, and what types of interactions were they?
I'd have to, I don't know.
Oh, I mean, we haven't looked at the interaction data yet, and that's part of the part of the analysis we're working on now in terms of the FIOs as well as the arrest data that we're receiving. We do have the information for the complaints, but we haven't looked at it just yet. We should have that available for our report come the end of June.
Okay, and in terms of the attrition, 21 officers out of the 100 left for some reason, and you had to use the alternates. And I noticed that 10 of those were assignment change, 15 for medical reasons, and it just seemed kind of a high number that 15 out of the 21 left for those reasons. And I was wondering if you could give any more details or specificity as to what those reasons were. And some left as early as 9 days into it.
Well, I think, you know, a lot of the offices, they're in some of our busier districts. So if, you know, they get in a lot of rows, what we call rows, disturbances, where, you know, they're rolling around on the ground, and we see more and more officers going out. So, you know, some of those officers with the cameras, whether the Youth Violence Task Force, they're busy districts. And so 15 of them went out with injuries. And, you know, as far as the 9 days, obviously, if someone gets moved and they get promoted, we have no control over that, or if they move into a different assignment. So I can get you more particular reasons why, but, you know, over the course of a year, for 15 officers in the busiest districts go out, you know, they work hard, and unfortunately they're going to get into situations where, you know, whether they throw out their shoulder, they break their fingers, struggling with someone with a gun. Those are the type of stuff we deal with. It's a dangerous job, and it involves a lot of physical. You know, dealing on the street, no one gives up easily. You know, they engage in a lot of struggles.
Yeah, and so I know others have questions. Just one follow-up, and then I'll come back for the second round, if that's okay, Mr. Chair. Just on this particular case around the alternates, could you tell me whether there was a gap from the time the original officer left to when a new officer came on board, or was that pretty seamless? Gap in time?
I'm not sure. I can get you that information.
Okay.
But
I appreciate it.
yeah, I could talk about the process. So
Yes.
we identified the alternate officers ahead of time, so we had a list to draw from. So basically, the next shift, as soon as we could make that switch, we did. The alternates had been previously trained, so it was just a matter of swapping one officer for another.
Thank you. I will save the rest.
Thank you very much.
Next
I'd just
round.
like to say thank you to Commissioner Evans very much. He has to get scooting because we have a 17-inch plus snowstorm coming in, and they're having a meeting. So obviously he wasn't aware that that storm was coming. So I appreciate you a lot of time, and yeah, we'll grill these guys when you're gone. All right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Councilor Michael Flaherty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, an opportunity as the Commissioner's leaving to commend him and his staff and obviously the Boston Police Department for the great job that they're doing so that we don't find ourselves and see ourselves and watch ourselves on national news like other jurisdictions have. And it's through his leadership and his team's leadership that I think that we're in a pretty good position as a city. So kudos to the commission, obviously, to our mayor and to the team that put together. Superintendent Daly, you had mentioned sort of I guess a full, you've mentioned the numbers 5 to 7 million. Kind of threw it out there that's like 5 to 7 grand, or like maybe, 50 to 70 grand. That's real dough, 5 to 7 million. It's a $2 million swing. So I guess is that full implementation for every officer, every superior officer, every detective, or is it based on what we have as a snapshot of the pilot program? The cost is ranging between 5 and 7. Could you maybe just put some substance between the 5 to 7 million?
Sure. So the estimate is based on an implementation of 1,500 cameras for the patrol force. It would also include some implementation costs, upgrading some of the network infrastructure, physical infrastructure, docking stations need to be added to the district, some construction around that. As the commissioner mentioned, staffing is also a prerequisite around, making reviewing video for public records requests, putting video together for court, things like that, administrative and technical staffing.
So that 5 to 7 million includes maintenance. That's the outfitting 1,500 officers, maintenance and repair, staffing, preservation of evidence.
Yes.
That type of stuff. And how long would we would be required to preserve the video?
That would be a policy question. Basically, what happens in most body camera implementations is the officer will tag a video based on the nature of the incident, and depending on what that tag is, that would place that particular footage into a retention bucket. So if it was related to a homicide, for instance, that would be held forever. If it was a littering arrest, it might be held for the duration of the court, and then another 90 days. So those things we'd have to reconfigure the system for that.
And then obviously recognizing collective bargaining agreements and issues. Would this be something that would be phased in, the 1,500, or is this going to be something that hits the street all at once?
So one approach that we've looked at is we'll need some lead time for a number of things, including procurement, negotiations, administrative ramp up, and things like that. So it would seem to be one approach would be to do this in a phased manner, have some lead time, and then look at maybe 6 months down the road, start to implement a limited number of the districts, and then ramp up from there as we go.
Okay. And then I know that we're still in the sort of the data collection phase with respect to the pilot program, and wanted to know whether or not have we recognized any type of cost savings, sort of maybe staving off litigation. Have we recognized or have any of the footage been used in either a criminal or a civil case to date? And then Commissioner, probably the best person, a chilling effect. One of the things I saw as an assistant DA was that more often than not at a crime scene, someone will walk up to a police officer or a detective and kind of give them the old, it was the guy over there in the red shirt, and he was driving a blue car, and they walk away. They don't want to be involved in it, but they at least give you a lead, a tip to kind of start the process. My concern would be the chilling effect that the Commissioner referenced, sort of that giving someone a break, which is very important, having that discretion, but also people willing to kind of come up and kind of give you the straight scoop almost immediately after a situation, but kind of don't want to be anywhere near a court proceeding or a police being mentioned in a police report, but they could give you some very vital and some very critical information at the very onset of a crime, and I don't know whether or not you have that data collection that indicates that person coming up and kind of giving you the straight scoop immediately thereafter, that's been diminished, So three questions from the data that you have right now. It's any cost savings recognized? Has any of the footage been used in criminal or civil trials? And you're recognizing or seeing any type of chilling effect similar to what the Commissioner talked about, which is the discretionary function?
Sure. So starting at the last question, we have not had any sort of anecdotal indication that people were scared off from the body cameras. It's hard to measure. It's not something that that we would know, but I haven't heard any anecdotal evidence from the officers about that. The video footage has been used regularly in court. The officers wearing the body cameras have been supplying the video to the court. So I don't know how many cases, but considerable amount of cases have been supported by body camera footage. As far as cost savings, again, hard to measure with small numbers in the pilot, but we do have 2 IAD cases that we know officer was wearing a body camera. I think 2 of those cases were not sustained because the officer was wearing a body camera and had that information there. So that's, again, it's you don't know what it could have led to, but we do have that small data set.
Very good. And then just finally, just through the chair, and this will be really important through our budget process in terms of that $5 to $7 million. That's a pretty big swing. Mm-hmm. It's a $2 million swing. So as you're getting more data, maybe that kind of gets the cost maybe kind of gets sharpened a little bit. But is that going to be coming out of the existing BPD budget, or is this something that's going to require additional funds from the administration and the council through our budget process? And if that's the case, if it's going to be new and additional funds, then those are real numbers that I need to see. And we're not going to be able to deal with a sort of a $2 million swing. We're going to really have to zone in as to what that number is for the all-in, for the 1,500 plus the maintenance repair, and all the stuff that goes with it.
So we're currently in discussion with the budget office on the costs related to body cameras and an implementation. And I don't know what will come out of those discussions, but I can tell you that we're looking at if we did a phased implementation, we would look for a placeholder of about $1.9 million.
Okay. And thank you, Superintendent Daley, for all the work that you do on this, and as well as your team here, Mr. McDevitt, Mr. Braga. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Councilor Flaherty. Councilor Edwards.
Chair, and I also wanted to echo my gratitude to Councilor Campbell for also initiating this conversation. I had a couple questions, and I don't know, some of them may be better directed toward the commissioner who's not here, so I might just go ahead and make this statement, and you let me know if you have the information for them. I'm particularly curious about the incidences of the camera not being activated at all in your core group of folks. Did you have that happen?
I'm only aware of one case where an inquiry was made around that, and we reviewed the video and found that did happen, and the officer acted strictly according to policy in that case. So
there are certain policies, as the commissioner mentioned, when it comes to domestic violence and entering some people's homes, where the public has the option to say, no, I don't want the camera in my home, and in those incidences only the police officers turn the camera off?
Yes. In entering a dwelling, the officer is obligated to announce that they're wearing and recording. And if the person in the dwelling, any person in that dwelling, states that they don't want the recording on, the officer is obligated to discontinue the recording. The only exception being if an exigent situation arises that the officer can elect to reactivate the camera.
So how are you notified that the camera's been turned off and we need to follow up with this officer? Is it you have a police report and no camera footage? How would you know to come?
So the only way we'd know is if we did spot checks, and we did through the pilot do random spot checks for compliance with policy, and our auditing department has some of that information, but they have not published their report yet. We expect that at about the same time as we have the final report.
So when this rolls, and by the way, I'll go on record saying, based on what the commissioner mentioned and some of the studies proving, I think actually some more positives than any negatives, the biggest negative being potential cost, I'm fully supportive of expanding this throughout the police department. But in that full expansion, are you going to have structurally within the program a way to follow up on cameras that are turned off, or is it just going to always be random and trying to find who turned off their camera?
That's a kind of a difficult situation, and just for the pilot, we had, almost 40,000 videos. So, and to watch a video requires someone to watch in real time. There's no real sort of way to compress that. So we rely on sort of a random selection of compliance oversight, and that's probably the model that we'll be looking at based on available staffing.
With regards to the videos and then privacy, so the commissioner had mentioned that or I think you also added to the fact that you would have to hire additional staff to make sure that you can comply with the FOIA requests that are coming up. I just was curious about who could stop a video from coming out. I mean, after a FOIA request coming, and I'm thinking immediately of the incident, not here, but in Chicago with Mayor, I think Emanuel stopping a video, most likely for his own political gain, of a person being shot several times by a police officer and then releasing it. And how would we stop special interests or particular political interests from preventing camera footage going out?
Well, the video produced by the body cameras would be considered public record under the public records law, and there are provisions in the law to redact to protect someone's privacy, and we'd follow the law.
Is there any opportunity for potentially to have a citizen committee reviewing the camera footage as they're coming in and also helping with responding to the FOIA requests, so that you have folks who are part of the redaction and part of the review of those videos before they go out to the public, being representative of the public?
That's something certainly to consider.
The commissioner had mentioned, and I think he'd probably be more appropriate to answer, so I'll just say this statement. The commissioner had mentioned the use of drones, and I'm sure none of you, I don't think you were expecting him to do that, but in as much as he had mentioned the use of drones being helpful, being something that they help with accidents, that they help with, being able to get there faster, looking at things after the bombing and so on and so forth, I would hope that he's also open to continued conversation about how the community is able to check how we are being policed and being surveyed. So I'd love to see if we couldn't follow other cities' models, such as Santa Barbara, where they have, potential new surveillance information or equipment coming before the city council, at which point we would look at it and then as a community agree this is how we're willing to be surveyed. So I'm just putting that out there as well before we look at all the different ways of looking at us, that we're part of that conversation, and that we look at that with at an annual basis with our budget as well. Just to go back to some of the statistical data, I'm particularly, and I'm not catching what you're saying when you say you're a comparative sample. I'm going to be just very direct. Are you saying that you took women, like a woman, white woman, black woman, police officer with a camera and one without, men? And is that what your comparative sample, was that what you're saying? I'm confused.
So we took the group of officers who were in those 5 districts and in the Youth Violence Strike Force who were working those 2 shifts, the day shift and the first half shift.
Right.
And all of the officers who were in assignments where they're actually providing police services, so not administrative assignments, we got the roster and we randomly allocated them to 2 groups. The nice thing about randomization, when you create those 2 groups in a random manner, they end up being the same or equivalent. So you're able to say, based on this apples to apples comparison, what's the difference in complaints and use of force, with the only difference between the 2 groups being the cameras.
So in your apples to apples, you had the same number of women, you had the same number of people of color. That's what I was meaning.
Yes,
so
exactly.
You had that. So you had demographically the same percentages of all of this ethnicity in one group and in the other as well.
Yes.
The only difference being the camera.
Exactly.
And just to echo what my colleague, Councilor Janey, had mentioned, there's a real concern that while we start with such low numbers, a lot of that has to do with the fact that people aren't coming forward, maybe due to lack of language skill set, maybe due to lack of immigration status, that people aren't coming forward to begin with, which then artificially depress the amount of complaints. And I understand you have to use what statistical data you can, but was there any way to get any other form of understanding how many incidents, not necessarily complaints, but incidents of use of force or beyond just whether someone filed a complaint or not?
I mean, the only way you'd be able to glean that would be through some of the interviews that Jack's been doing with the community to get a sense for the prevalence of that. Because for the statistical analysis, we're reliant on the data that's available, and that's just the complaint data as it is and the use of force data as the Boston Police keeps it.
And is that based on your studying of other, is that typical ways of studying the use of cameras, only looking at filed complaints? There's been no other example of going into the community, getting a sample, doing phone interviews, none of that?
Oh, there have been other examples of folks looking at how community members in areas that received cameras versus ones that did not react to the introduction of cameras on police officers. And by and large, those studies tend to suggest positive effects. The communities welcome them. They, feel that they add to the transparency of policing and other positive benefits such as that.
And just two more questions. I know. 2 more questions. So we all saw, or I know several folks saw the recent camera footage with Officer, I think it's Crossan, and I'm assuming he was not part of this.
Actually, he was part of the body camera pilot, but he was not wearing a body camera. The pilot had ended by that point.
So he was part of the pilot. The pilot program had ended.
Yes.
By the time he had done this and someone else caught him on their cell phone?
Yes.
Okay. So, again, another indication of why I really support having body cameras. It's unfortunate that he was out of the program when this happened. And then just in light of the protracted negotiations with the union to have a strong policy for the pilot program, what's the overall plan to ensure adoption of a strong policy with comprehensive privacy protections? So how are we going to put this in? How are we going to implement this and make sure that we're still protecting privacy?
So the policy development piece, we do have, for the pilot, we put together a policy that we worked with the Social Justice Task Force to develop, and we had a number of meetings with community groups. So we would extend that. We would take any lessons learned from the pilot and extend the existing policy into a full implementation.
Thank you.
President Campbell just wants to jump in for a split second.
The policy piece, that did come up quite a bit during the community meetings and discussions related to body cameras, particularly around privacy. And we reviewed several different policies and adopted language from some of the ACLU's language around privacy to incorporate that into the policy, and some of the other activists as well, some of their language. The department did adopt some of that, and I think that's critical to note too.
And just one other follow-up to that quickly, Council Flaherty's point, one of the places where the camera's supposed to be turned off is if a confidential informant comes forward and tries to give you information. So that's part of the policy, that if that happened as he was describing and someone came up at a crime scene and said, then the camera would not be activated.
That's right.
Councilor Josh Acom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you, Superintendent. I think this is great how we've done this in the city of Boston, this pilot program. I want to thank President Campbell for, was it 2 years or a year of these meetings and leading this and getting us to this point. So it's much appreciated. It's a huge service, I think, to both the police department and the people of the city of Boston. And I'm encouraged to hear that, especially relative to other departments, that we start off with a low baseline. I think of use of force, of complaints, and that sort of fits in with a lot of the data, anecdotal and otherwise, and research-based that we see about the Boston Police Department. I think the men and women do a great job. I think it comes down to training. I think it comes down to leadership, and I appreciate that. Having said that, I do think there's a real need to expand this program, and noting that the way I and many of my constituents and others interact with the police department may be different from different communities, people with different backgrounds, and I think it's important that people feel safe on both sides. And I think it sounds like our police officers are well served by these cameras, as well as members of the community, and making sure that people are feeling better and more comfortable as weighing the privacy concerns. And I guess this has sort of been asked and answered already, but I'd like to drill down a little bit, and perhaps it needs to happen through community meetings as opposed to, just numbers and statistics. But is there a sense that folks in our neighborhoods are generally more comfortable, they feel safer, they feel better with these cameras on? And I don't know if that goes to you, Superintendent, or you gentlemen, about the research aspect of it. I think that's the ultimate goal here. Obviously, we want to make sure that people are behaving well on both sides of this, but what's your sense from your discussions if people feel safer, whoever wants to?
Sure. In the community group meetings that I've been at, people do feel safer. They do feel better about their interactions with the police. In general, there are some. It's not 100%, but more that the majority of folks feel that this is better for policing and it's better for their interactions and increased trust in the police.
Okay. So I guess, given my outstanding colleagues here, most of the questions I had were asked. I have one more and then, maybe two more. We often have talked about in the context of this dashboard cameras on police cars. Boston, we don't have them. Now, whether they certainly don't need to be mutually exclusive, but what's our feeling on that? Is there any movement on that? And I know it's a little off topic. I apologize to the sponsor and the chairman, but is that part of this discussion? Is there a way to couple these together?
There is, and actually, the feeling is that they need to be coupled together, that you cannot have two different sort of platforms that doing the same thing, one gathering information from a body camera, the other one from a car. They're basically producing the same thing. So you need the same back end, everything working together. So I think it's just a question of setting the priorities. I think the body cameras is the thing we're looking at most closely now. But any other video collection device should be part of the same system.
Great. And I do think this hearing and ones like it are helpful. I think it's regrettable that in many instances we feel like people are being pitted against each other in this discussion. I think we share the same goals. I think we have a great police department, and I think community relations are better than in many other comparable cities. Having said that, I do experience the city of Boston, as an individual, as who I am, as a white, able-bodied male who is usually in a suit, so I may be interacting with police and others much different than other people in the city of Boston, residents and visitors. So I want to be cognizant of that and make sure that we are working together thoughtfully to make the city safer and more equitable for everyone. So I want to thank you for your work. I look forward to continuing these discussions and seeing a full implementation here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilor Zagum. Councilor Asabi George.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks again to Council President Campbell for calling for this hearing. I also want to thank my colleagues for asking and commenting pretty in depth. So my questions will be brief. Has there been any reflection on the two models? Because as I recall, there were two models of cameras sampled.
Yes, we had two different vendors come in, and we kind of split it right down the middle. Both had strengths and weaknesses from their technical offerings. Operationally, both worked the way they were advertised, but we're going to do a deeper dive into performance, technical performance, reliability, and things like that before we make any decision on a procurement.
And then, considering that, were there any survey results or information from police officers who wore the body cameras as to the preferable model? And to, comfort, ease of use, ability to turn on or turn off, but then also, were they secure to their uniform? Were they, a distraction or got in the way of performing duties?
Yes, we collected information both from the officers wearing the cameras and the technicians who were servicing the cameras, and we had some clear patterns between the two vendors, regarding some of those issues.
Right. I think that's it for me. My questions have been asked and answered, so that's great. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councilor. My good friend from District 6, Councilor Matt O'Malley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, President Campbell, for your leadership on this, and to my colleagues. I will be brief.
Thank you also to all the activists who are here, particularly Sagan, who used to work here, who's been a real leader on this. Glad to be with you. Thank you, gentlemen, for your great work. I think we have the best police force, not only in the country and the world, and I think this truly is the city where community policing was born and was done exceptionally well, and I could go on and on. So I appreciate your leadership, and I also think that this process, really led by Councilor Campbell in her capacity as the former public safety chair before Councilor McCarthy, and someone who has been a great advocate for this, has once again exemplified what the Boston way means as it relates to public safety and police, and making sure that we have some may have argued that this was a slower rollout, and I think there's some merit to that, but it was done deliberately and it was done well. So I have a couple of questions. I think the commissioner brought up the point, I think he was citing Las Vegas as officers felt that they couldn't give breaks to kids if someone's pulled over, for example, for speeding or something. That was something, an unintended consequence. But I guess wouldn't there be certain discretion that couldn't an officer, I don't know, that worries me too, because that is a pretty compelling argument he made, but I also feel that that might actually help things. In other words, if I'm pulled over for speeding and Councilor Sabi George is an officer wearing a camera who pulls me over, and if she explains, I'm not, I'm going to give you a warning this time, but you need to do that. I don't know. I guess maybe that's just one example, and I'm not getting sort of the point, but I do think, and if anyone wants to tell me why I'm wrong on that. I guess the question that I am asking in this long-winded way is, why would body cams prevent an officer from giving a break to someone who was pulled over?
It's something that's hard to measure, but I think what the commissioner was getting at is the officers use discretion on a day-to-day basis.
Sure.
Sometimes that discretion might be that they would make a value judgment and give someone a break and not worry about being second-guessed about that, just kind of follow their heart. Wearing a body camera, they might take a more technical view of the use of discretion and
I guess I sort of see it, but I do think, I don't know, I think the two ought not be mutually exclusive.
I agree.
Officers giving breaks and also having wearing a body cam. Secondly, there was someone had brought up concern that, or maybe Councilor Flaherty or one of you had brought up, the concern of people being unwilling to talk to an officer because of that. Wouldn't an officer have the discretion to turn the camera off in a situation like that, just as they would going into someone's home?
Depending on the circumstances, we don't want to give too much latitude to the officers to just turn the camera off, but we want to sort of give specific circumstances that are common sense that would allow them to be able to use the discretion to turn the camera off.
Yeah.
And if it was a case of an informant or someone who you might put at risk, they could turn it off, but the other remedy would be that they would still be wearing the physical camera. And if the interaction was recorded, we could redact that as for privacy or law enforcement purposes.
So the concern would be, even if it is shut off or redacted, just the act of wearing the camera could be a deterrent to someone, maybe?
It could be, but I think as officers wear cameras on a regular basis, that becomes normalized behavior, and people would get used to it.
Is there, forgive my ignorance, I have seen them, but is there like a little red light that would indicate to someone that it's off, the way those old handheld? Okay, so that's helpful. And then, are they run by battery or by, so they all have a battery. And what's the battery life typically?
It should be more than 8 hours.
And then you charge it?
Yes.
Okay. And how long does it take to fully charge?
It'll charge, again, depending on the models. The technology gets better every year.
Of course.
But it usually goes into its base station to do two things: to charge overnight and to upload any video that it has. So it'll be there for the full 2 shifts that the officer is not working. It will, but they charge in a much shorter time.
Yeah, of course, like a phone would as well.
2 or 3 hours.
So I guess in a way to cut costs, couldn't we buy, instead of having one for every officer, couldn't we have one for every 2 officers?
We could do that. It would save some money. Probably would be logistically challenging to make sure that the right camera went to the right person every day. And on the other hand, the costs are more on the back end for storage, platform support. So I think, a cost-benefit analysis might show that you might save some money, but you might not save enough to make it worth your while.
Interesting. Okay. And then, so full implementation, you think would be 5 to 7 million the first year, if everyone?
If we did a complete 1,500 officer implementation.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then if it would be significantly less if it was phased in. I think the commissioner was saying, or perhaps you were saying, Soup, roll it off in more heavily trafficked stations.
Yes.
Okay. And how much of that, so it still has to be collectively bargained for an officer to wear it?
Yes.
If we were to change the colors of the police officer's uniform, would that have to be collectively bargained?
I don't think so. I think it depends on what we're doing.
Yeah. Well, I think there's been some, I think you're hearing more and more support of this idea, and I would, certainly among officer friends of mine as well, and certainly some of the comments that were made today. So I guess, so why is this different? Why is a change of the uniform different? I understand it is, of course, it's different, but why couldn't the commissioner just say, all right, from now on, every patrolman is wearing a camera on his or her uniform?
I suppose the commissioner could do that, but he would be cognizant of any repercussions that might occur.
They'll file the worry being that the
exactly.
union will file a grievance.
It's better to reach a consensus.
No, I agree with that, and I'm a big supporter of the Patrolmen's Association, but I do think there's maybe more common ground here that we ought to be finding. So that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilor O'Malley. So just a couple protocol issues. The new hearing, we passed the rules in January, actually January 1st, that we're going to allow testimony from the public before our second round. That way they don't have to sit around and wait all day, because some people have to get home. We're actually at work, so we don't want to keep people here as long as they need to. So there's 3 people so far who have signed up to testify. Christopher Lucy, Charu Verma, and Rachel Rollins. So there's 2 microphones there. I'd also like to put on the record that I did receive a letter from Ayanna Presley, City Councilor at Large. The gist of it is that she regrets that she cannot be here. She has a long-standing scheduling conflict, but she does want to thank the chair and the author of the order for continuing the conversation. I would also like to thank the Boston Police Department for their participation. She'd also like to take the opportunity to reiterate that for her support for full implementation of body-worn camera program for Boston Police Department. So I wanted to put that on the record. And then I also got a text message from our Ways and Means Chair, Mark Siomo, who's home with the flu, but he is watching. So Mark, I hope you feel better. And his question was, he's always on the money, that's what his job is, how much of the $5 to $7 million could be a capital purchase, and then what would the yearly cost be for maintenance if that was a capital purchase?
So I think it's software as a service, so I think we'd have to look into see if we could fit that into into the capital bucket. I'm just not sure about that.
Okay. So there you go, Mark. Stumping from Alston and Brighton. Thanks very much. Okay. So Christopher Lucy, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon, esteemed members of the City Council, members of the panel, members of the department, some of whom have left, Commissioner Evans. Police-worn body cams are powerful tools. I think somebody else has recounted that today here in this chamber, that can convey benefits on law enforcement, jurisprudence, and community relations. But one of the most important factors in their use is standards and policies for the information and the data that they collect after they collect it and during the process of collecting it. And 2 things that I want to make remark of particularly are that, in my personal opinion, or also restore the Fourth's opinion, I'm here sort of on their behalf today too, that no officer should be able to view any information, any visual information or any data until they've actually written an incident report and filed it with the appropriate authorities for receiving those reports. And the other one is the one that some of the other councilors have spoken to today, is that there ought to be a policy in place for releasing information under the auspices of the court, of course, for any incidents for people who have complaints against any particular officer or the department in general and are taking that to court as litigants in process. And I think this applies for all cases. The case that one of the councilors mentioned was the Chicago case, where I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that Mayor Emanuel was ordered to release the video by the court. And he did that reluctantly, if I remember reading the news reports correctly on that. So those are the 2 points that I want to make today. With regards to that, I know there are discretionary and budgetary issues. I'm sure that you'll be discussing some of these policy and standard issues on your deliberations. There may be state law that also eventually addresses these things. I know that there works in the foot on Beacon Hill in that regard. And that I hope that you will take all of these matters under serious consideration in your deliberations. And I thank you very much for your time today as a resident of the city. Thank you for taking this seriously.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Charu?
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Hi there, everybody. My name is Charu Verma. I work for the Committee for Public Counsel Services as a full-time public defender, but I'm actually here testifying on behalf of the Massachusetts Bar Association Criminal Reform or Criminal Justice Reform Working Group. It's kind of a clunky title, but it's a group that's comprised of the Criminal Justice section at the Massachusetts Bar Association, which I am on, and then the Civil Rights section, and so we actually brought a report I would like to distribute to the council members, and I apologize for just rushing in. I was in court all morning. So this is a report that was endorsed by the House of Delegates of the Massachusetts Bar Association. If I could draw your attention specifically to section 4 and 5, it is a resolution that, as I said, that was adopted unanimously by the House of Delegates in support of a resolution in support of body cameras. It's important to note that these resolutions were unanimously approved by the Massachusetts Bar Association's House of Delegates. The House of Delegates is comprised of leaders from county and minority bars from across the state and contains a very diverse legal and geographic viewpoints. The fact that the House of Delegates stood united in support of these resolutions with no dissent speaks volumes, I think, to the adoption of body cameras. Starting with Resolution 5, which is on page 24, which supports the police use of body-worn cameras, the working group feels strongly that it's not a question of if body cameras will be a requirement for all law enforcement in Massachusetts, but when will body cameras become a requirement. And we realize that the delay is in large part financial. And we urge the council and any legislators to provide the funding necessary to implement this program. And we feel strongly that now is the time to adopt something like body-worn cameras. I did have a chance to review the report that is being testified about today. One of the concerns that the committee has is that some of the statistical vectors are very narrow in terms of just looking at citizen police complaints and things like that. We think that if you actually broaden out some of the data points, there might be more information that's provided rather than some of the small statistical differences that were presented in the report. We also think that the use of body cameras can provide sort of hidden benefits as well with enhanced data collection, enhancing community stakeholders being a part of the process in implementing the use of body cameras, policies and procedures such like that. And inclusion of community stakeholders is a very important part of this process. Another thing and I will just finish with this, I've had the opportunity through the committee to view some and read decisions of some of the body camera footage that was presented and available. We think that this footage like this can be dispositive on both sides of the fence. So it isn't just for defense attorneys. I think the Commonwealth, our arguments on behalf of the Commonwealth can also be strengthened by looking at footage such as that. So we would adopt and urge the council to propose legislation that would require the use of body cameras for police departments throughout the city. And I urge you to read the report that we provided all of it in its entirety because it's riveting. But specifically number 4 and 5, I think, pertain very specifically to the hearing today. Is there any questions?
Thank you very
Great.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you for my snow day homework. Rachel?
Thank you, Chairman McCarthy and members Campbell and Janey. I'm Rachel Rollins. I'm here in my capacity as the Chair of Legal Redress for the NAACP Boston branch. I want to start by saying that the branch has a deep respect for law enforcement and the hard job that they do, and I can personally speak to the fact that it's often thankless and that we appreciate the men and women that do the job every day. We would like to ask that you not wait for the study and that there's full implementation now, and ask that the mayor put money in his budget or the budget to reflect that implementation. I'd also like to just state, we've heard today a lot about discretion and giving people a break. This is a good plug, I believe, to say that we really need members of law enforcement and possibly even of this panel that better reflect the communities, that the rich and diverse communities of Boston. We ask that there are policies in place with respect to when the cameras are turned on and off, and there's transparency and citizen oversight. And those are our comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I think we're going to have a second round, so if you can, I know this is new for us. Does anybody else want to testify before we go around one more time? No, they didn't sign.
Rasan, did you sign in? Oh, you did?
It's not here. It's not on this one.
Hey, you're just signing autographs on the way in.
So if you can state your name and affiliation for the record.
That has happened. Rasan Hall, I'm the director of the Racial Justice Program for the American Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts. Thank you, members of the council, Madam President, Mr. Chair, and other members here. The ACLU is thankful for you all hosting or holding this hearing. Since 2014, when we released our report, Black, Brown, and Targeted, we strongly urged the Boston Police Department to adopt a body-worn camera policy or program and supported by strong privacy protections and a robust policy to ensure that the information that is captured within the body-worn camera footage, as well as the privacy protections and concerns of the residents of Boston are well protected. It was particularly disturbing when that report was initially released from us that showed that there were racial disparities in who was stopped, interrogated, observed, and frisked by the Boston Police Department. Despite only making up 24% of the city's population, black people made up 63% of those police-civilian interactions, and we felt that it was appropriate at that time that the department adopt body-worn cameras. It has only since been all the more emphasized through what we've seen in national conversations around policing and the interaction of police with community and the way that body-worn cameras serve as an accountability measure. Certainly, by no stretch of the imagination are they a panacea, but they are a valuable tool to increase transparency and accountability. As recently as several weeks ago, we've seen the value of recording police-civilian interactions. As was referenced not too long ago, Officer Croson, who was actually, surprisingly, a part of this pilot program, had an interaction with a pedestrian in Boston, a young African-American man, where we saw a level of interaction that verged on conduct that was questionable as to its constitutionality, but also raised some concerns around the level of respect or disrespect shown to that young man. And while there's a tension between community and police officers, we can really get to the heart of why people are less willing to engage with police when we see videos like that. We are encouraged by the initial report, but we look forward to the full report. And as has been mentioned before, there is also a need for a broad array of metrics to evaluate what success actually looks like. Another thing that could be considered is how that footage is impacting the outcomes of criminal cases. It's our understanding that there have been several cases that have been impacted by body-worn camera footage, both in a negative and a positive way. And so I encourage the City Council to continue to rigorously examine representatives from the department. I would also note that to the extent that there is a conversation about other technological advancements and surveillance tools, that we would have a similarly robust conversation like the one that we've been having for body-worn cameras. And to the extent that there are concerns around costs of body-worn cameras, I would only acknowledge and note some of the recent reports in the Boston Globe and other papers regarding the amount of overtime costs that are being spent, or as Councilor Campbell raised, the amount of payout that has been happening with law enforcement settlements of police misconduct cases. So we urge that you do everything that is within the province of this body to encourage the Boston Police Department to implement a full body-worn camera policy and practice with strong privacy protections and a robust and comprehensive policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Segun, how are you, sir?
Hi, everybody.
You and Rashawn have now signed up for the Boston
the
City
newsletter.
Council newsletter. So welcome aboard. Welcome aboard. You're on. Segun,
I'm looking forward to it. Good afternoon. For the record, my name is Shagun Idawu, Hyde Park resident, 02136. I don't know what other information might be needed. I'm here in my capacity as one of the organizers of the Boston Police Camera Action Team, or BPCAT, which has been pushing for body cameras. Councilor Zakim noted we've been talking about this for maybe a year. This actually marks the 4th year that we've been talking about body cameras in Boston. So how much fun we're having that we're here today still. So I actually originally didn't intend on delivering testimony, was appreciative of the fact that Councilor Campbell initiated this conversation again, someone who's been pushing for this issue ever since she got the seat. So we appreciate that. There were just 2 things that I wanted to note. The first is that even though this marks the 4th year of us talking about body cameras, we are still talking about whether or not we should do body cameras, and I think that is, we should already be at the discussion about policy. So a lot of questions that came up today, which again, I appreciate all of the councilors, not only who are here, but the questions that you asked today, which I thought were really important and insightful. I was over here jumping and jerking in my seat because I wanted to, make sure that some of these questions were asked, and so I appreciate that they were asked today. But a lot of the questions were around policy, and so it would be great for the next hearing that we have to actually start talking about what that policy looks like, since it seems that BPD is on this track of actually implementing this program, which is great news to hear, not something that we knew before today. And so at the next hearing, it would be great to talk about the policy that the NAACP, ACLU, that BPCAT, that all of us worked on to produce and have been circulating for the last 3 of those 4 years. And so hopefully that will address a lot of the questions that were asked today. The second point is just about as Mr. McDevitt is reaching out to the community to get community input, it would be great for the City Council and other organizations that are either represented here today or not here today to begin reaching out to folks and actually coming up with some option for people to, call in or write a note online or something about their experience with body cameras. I'm not exactly sure which groups have been interviewed so far, but it would be great for them to reach out to other members of the community, just as we have that process for people to deliver, to file a complaint online. They should be able to talk about their interactions with body cameras online as well. And the last thing I'll note is that, Councilor O'Malley, I appreciated your question. I myself am for orange uniforms for our Boston police officers, but I look forward to talking to Commissioner Evans about that later on. So anyway, thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. So we're in Oh, one more? Yeah. Did you sign up for our newsletter too?
I did sign up. I checked
right,
no,
excellent.
however, on the first go around, if I could. My name is Scott Nanny, Clifford Scott Nanny, and I'm a town meeting member for representing Precinct 10 of Brookline, which, as you know, is surrounded on three sides by Boston, but has not yet been annexed by it. And I introduced a warrant article for our spring town meeting implementing the ACLU's CCOPS model for our town. Our police departments work together quite a lot, and decisions made by one affect the other through formal information sharing agreements, if nothing else. And so I'm eager to sort of keep tabs on the effort in Boston and to sort of hopefully establish a process in Brookline that can work together with that. I'd like to just briefly mention we also have no body cameras as of yet in Brookline, no dashboard cameras as of yet in Brookline. We do have traffic cameras which weren't mentioned but are part of the same sort of surveillance system. And my intention in introducing the warrant article in Brookline is to establish a sort of forward-looking, comprehensive way for the community, importantly, to be able to provide oversight on these technologies. And so that's the one statement that I really wish to make here to you, is to encourage you to embrace the Community Oversight Committee model that the ACLU and others are recommending for the way that because I think the details of these policies ultimately matter a lot, and we've heard a lot about how the details of exactly when the officers turn on and off their cameras and how you check that they are doing that appropriately, whether it's spot checks or other mechanisms. I think those details are important. Those details are something that I think a community advisory committee would be well placed to dig into on a periodic basis to ensure that all these new technologies, this is sort of the tip of the iceberg, as I think we all know, are going to be implemented in a way that respects civil liberties. And lastly, just on a slightly light note, I will note that there are ways of figuring out whether the sort of chilling effect is happening. As far as I know, and I'm not an expert, I believe it's called the nose-picking delay, which is whenever you're doing a study with a camera pointed at a subject, you find out how long it is before they start picking their nose. And that gives you a rough estimate of when they've forgotten that the camera's on, right? So I think there are ways that on the academic side, as we study body cameras, you can look at maybe not that exact metric, but other metrics like that to sort of figure out, are people actually aware, being reticent because of there's camera that's pointed at them, or are they interacting naturally? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll start our second round. I just have one quick question. You know, as we move forward, will patrol supervisors also be wearing cameras as we move forward, or will it just continue to be the patrolmen and the patrolwomen?
The initial plan is for patrol officers first, and then we'll probably have subsequent discussions about the superior officers, depending on their roles in the department.
Okay. That's it for me.
Thank you, Councilor McCarthy, and thank you to the folks who testified. This is always insightful to get information from the community, and I too have to acknowledge that I got to the council only a couple of years ago. This conversation had started way before I got to the council, so I appreciate the residents and the folks who have been working on this, including officers and the department as well. And have to acknowledge Shakia, who works currently in my office, who was the second half of BPCAT and did a lot of work with respect to this issue. I just have two quick follow-up questions. With respect to negotiating, I'm assuming that if we do this and at some point do it with full implementation, the other bargaining units will also be participating in the bargaining related to this particular issue? Yes, where they are impacted, some more than others, is in how the body camera footage affects their day-to-day job responsibilities. And then my last question, or I guess it's two, it's for you, Jack. I thought Shagun's point on having some outreach or platform for folks to proactively reach out to you if they have thoughts and ideas, we can continue that, but I think it's a great idea. I wasn't sure, I think the Social Justice Task Force talked about just that, doing it in some creative way versus not just going out into meetings, right? You're only one person, or you only have so many people on your team. So how can we set up online or something that elicits feedback from the community with respect to this issue?
Yeah, I think Sigun has a great idea, and we can work with your office to figure out the best model for how to get those comments. We'd love to have them.
And we can share that, of course, through Councilor McCarthy and my colleagues. And lastly, I know we're waiting for the final report to come out in June, but based on what I'm hearing, based on what you guys have testified to today, and Anthony as well, do you anticipate the final report changing anything in terms of the list of benefits or those suggested benefits we've already identified related to body cameras?
It's hard to tell what the final report will do, but it will, one thing that it will do, it will speak to some of the other indicators that people have mentioned, you know, like has there been depolicing, have policing changed, has it been changed in terms of certain groups? So we'll have more information on that.
And more metrics used in the final analysis?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Jack.
Sure.
Thank you,
very
Councilor
much.
McCarthy.
Councilor Campbell, Councilor Ed Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Superintendent, as it relates to BPD in the community on both sides of the debate, I know the video is only a tool that will be used to determine evidence in a trial, but what would the process be if one side may disagree with the video, that it didn't capture the entire scene? Is there some type of an appeal process that one side or the other could weigh in on?
I'm not sure in what circumstances, you know, there would be an appeal within, but I think, you know, the video from the camera would speak for itself, and I think if we had multiple officers wearing video, that we would look at, you know, the totality by pulling video from other perspectives or other cameras that were available, and, you know, getting as much information about a particular incident to fill in context around anything that might have been missing in the video frame.
Okay. And I know during the turn on, turn off of the camera, can a police officer use discretion? I know there are some cases where he could use discretion, him or her could use a discretion, outside of the reasons you would enact, using their discretion based on their years of service, their professionalism, and what would that type of discretion?
Well, sort of the catch-all for discretion by the officer would be an exigency, where if something came up that was so far out of the ordinary that would require either the camera be turned on or be turned off. But in those cases, you know, an after-the-fact justification would be required for, you know, that non-compliance.
Okay. As it relates to the community service officer in the district and in the community engaging in the public, would the community service officer be wearing a body camera?
I think the community service officer would likely be issued a body camera, but there are roles within the police department where using a body camera or wearing a body camera would not be productive. We have officers who are booking officers. We have officers who do administrative tasks. If someone's at a community meeting, if they're not out on patrol doing enforcement work, there may be circumstances where they would not be required to wear a body camera.
Yeah, in my experience, I've seen a lot of CSOs engage the public. They have great conversations, learning about what's happening in a particular neighborhood, what concerns there are. But I think people would like to talk to the CSO, knowing that their information is confidential.
Sure, absolutely.
And I know the question's been asked several times, and I've asked it. For the first year, it'd be $5 to $7 million to get all the patrolmen with the body camera. But when it breaks down, the technical parts of the camera, how much would you envision that would cost each year in terms of replacing, fixing damaged cameras? Do other departments around the country have a figure similar to what they would spend on that might be helpful to you?
So we would look at a model that would be inclusive, that we would purchase the service. So you'd get a camera. You'd have probably anywhere between maybe an 18-month refresh cycle on that camera, that if the camera stopped working for any reason, you just swap that out. So basically, we wouldn't be paying for every device to be activated and reactivated. We'd buy a package, and we'd expect the vendor to provide those end-to-end services from the docking station to the camera to the software to view the video, to the cloud service that would store the video and handle the retention. That's the model that a lot of police departments are looking at. A lot of vendors are moving to that all-in-one package. I think there's some savings and economy of scale there. So that's one of the things that we would be looking closely at.
Thank you, Superintendent.
Thank you very much, Councilor. Councilor Janey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Superintendent. Thank you for the work that you and your department do every single day. Also want to acknowledge and thank the advocates who are in the room and for all your good work. Rather than offer a long list of questions, I guess just to wrap up, and I know some of these have already been answered by my colleagues, but so we know the report's coming out in June, the final report. I'm wondering if you could just give a quick timeline of what the next steps are. So we hear that the DAs are supporting, the officers are on boards, clearly the advocates here. I think there's support here among my colleagues. So what are the next steps to make this real? Just a timeline.
Sure. This is assuming a decision is made to move forward and assuming that a budget allocation is made to provide the funds to move forward. We anticipate that probably for the first half of the next fiscal year that we would begin a procurement process which could involve a request for proposals, evaluation process, and at the same time we would also be having conversations with the unions and working out some of the administrative issues that would have to resolve before an implementation. And with all that in mind, I think a good target would be the end of this calendar year.
Thank you. That's it.
All right. I think that'll wrap it up. Before we close up, though, I do want to let everybody know that Boston Public Schools are closed tomorrow. Boston Centers for Youth and Family is also closed tomorrow, and the parking ban starts tonight at 7 o'clock. So, as far as docket number 0160, order for hearing to review the Boston Police Department's Body Worn Camera Pilot Program preliminary study results, I'd like to thank everybody for being here. This hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.